At the end of last week's class, 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, we had the Nyungne last week. 2 weeks ago, we read this verse and I commented on it very briefly, and I'm just going to do a little more commentary on it today. But let's go ahead and read that verse, verse 8, and then we'll proceed. Verse on page 8 there in the middle. Please bless me to see that this greatly meaningful body with freedoms and richnesses is difficult to find and easily perishes, that action and result are so profound, and that the sufferings of the evil-gone transmigratory beings are so difficult to bear. Therefore, please bless me to take refuge from the depths of my heart in the three rare sublime ones, to abandon negative karma, and to accomplish virtue according to Dharma. So this verse starts off with the idea that we are in this amazing, opportune state right now. You know, we sort of take our human existence for granted, not really thinking about what the importance of this life is. This whole practice, we can say, is really about taking advantage of this human life. The title that Rinpoche gave to it, again, is transforming, the method to transform a suffering life into happiness, a life that can be filled with a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, into the cause for happiness, how to make it into something that will even generate that happiness and joy as we practice it. So this greatly meaningful body that we currently possess came about through the force of our own actions, it said. Again, this is the concept of karma that's mentioned a couple of times in this verse. Karma is a really central teaching in Buddhism. It's not something that we can understand in terms of witnessing it. Scientists can't prove this in a laboratory. They can't sit there and say, we have the proof for karma existing. But karma is part of, it's a subset of the greater law of cause and effect that we see in the world around us. So we have great conviction in the law of cause and effect when it comes to the world around us. I speak about this frequently because I think it's so obvious that we do take this as a principle that we have to abide by. We know that we have to create the causes and conditions for the types of results that we want to experience. I use the example sometimes of a vegetable garden. Maybe in winter it's not a good example, but you know, in the springtime, if you want to have a vegetable garden by the end of summer, towards the end of summer, you know that you have to do some things to have that happen, right? You can't say, oh, I had a vegetable garden last year, so I'm just going to wait for the vegetables to appear in my garden this year. You know that if you don't take that time and energy and plan it all out and figure out what you need to do and make sure that you tend to it throughout those months, you don't get all that bounty of vegetables at the end of this, you know, growing period. And so anyway, this is the idea of karma. Karma is also operating in the vein of cause and effect. It's just that we don't always have access to what the causes are for the effects that we're experiencing. The karma is essentially cause and effect when the experiences of beings are involved. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in one teaching, he said, if there's a branch of a tree that happens to fall in the woods and there's no beings around to experience it or to have anything, you know, injured from it or whatever, then we could say that that's sort of the natural law of cause and effect. But if there's this person sitting underneath the tree and the branch happens to fall and they get bopped on the head by it, well, then that's karma. It's not just, we're not denying also that there's some sort of cause and effect that the branch became weak and fell, but that is, the fact that it's falling on that particular being means that they must have created some causes and conditions for that to occur. Of course, they also create causes and conditions for the wonderful things to occur, you know, all the delightful, delicious things we have in our lives too. So developing some conviction around the law of cause and effect is an important part of this initial stages of the path. That's why it's highlighted so much. But right from the very beginning, when we see we've got this greatly meaningful body, this did not come about from nothing. Everything arises from its respective causes and conditions. This human body that we have is actually said to be quite rare to attain because we have to practice at least 3 major things to get it. The very first is that we have to practice good morality, which means abiding by the law of cause and effect, which means avoiding those negative actions that will be causing us to go to a lower rebirth and creating the positive actions that will allow us to have a good rebirth. In Buddhist terms, again, I've talked about this previously in this course, but mind has a continuity. The phenomenon that we call mind is not physical. It is created from prior moments of mind. So even the first moment of mine in this life had a prior moment of mine that had to do with the prior life, and so on. So there's no beginning to our minds. There's no end to our minds. So what happens to mind in terms of its experiences is dictated by karma. So the very first thing we have to attend to in terms of creating the causes for a good rebirth like this is to be vigilant in avoiding bad morality, avoiding killing other beings, avoiding stealing from them, avoiding lying to them, other ways of being affecting others in harmful ways, as well as even the mental states that we engage in that can also be very harmful to ourselves. So all of those things, if we avoid all of that and practice good morality, if we are able to protect the lives of others, protect their possessions, speak as honestly and truthfully as possible, try to bring people together, speak harmoniously, all these kinds of things create positive virtue, positive karma, the virtuous karma that will propel us into a good rebirth. So this current rebirth that we have came about primarily from your practice of good morality. Congratulations. You all did a wonderful job at some point in your past lives creating the cause for this life. Now you've got this life. You have to still deal with the fact that it's difficult to practice good morality. We live in a world where, we're not supported in that frequently in terms of the world around us. So the second factor is that you do also have to engage in as much as possible practices such as generosity, patience, and so on. These other practices that kind of fill out your existence into being in a good state. I would guess that most of us in the room have some level of affluence. It's not to say that everyone has the same, but we're all well fed, well clothed. We all have created the causes for that. All of those things you have in your life as well came about through your own good karma. If you don't tend to those in this life by being generous with your resources, by helping others, by being a benefit to other beings around you, you don't create the causes to have that help in your own life, in your own future lives. Your resources will be bereft if you don't practice generosity in this life. And that's the main one that's highlighted in this second cause. The third cause to get this rebirth is to practice these pure, stainless prayers, meaning that you actually have to intend to get a rebirth like this, make some strong motivation to have this. That's essentially what this first level of the stages of the path is doing, is helping us to steer our minds to at least use this human life to get another human life when this life ends. Again, maybe some of you don't have that level of conviction in karma yet, and that's okay. Well, I like to use what Venerable Rabina suggests. Many of you know Venerable Rabina, wonderful nun from Australia. She'll be back here in April of next year, and she's a wonderful teacher, my first teacher in this tradition in the FPMT. And she essentially says, use the idea of karma as a working hypothesis. You don't have to, wait for the conviction that you probably, again, aren't going to get for quite some time on your spiritual path. It's very hard to understand all the intricacies of karma. In fact, it's only a Buddha's mind that knows all the detailed workings of karma. But if we can kind of take it as a hypothesis and say, okay, this is what the Buddha says, that if I engage in these particular actions, I create the causes for those particular results. And just see what results you get from practicing in this way. Now, again, don't be too intent on the immediate results, but the long-term benefit to your mind and to your experience on the basis of practicing in this way. Venerable Rabina says we should treat it just like, we're scientists, use this as a working hypothesis, see if we get the results that we are desiring on the basis of this thesis that our actions have consequences. But I would suggest that even while we're doing that, we're going to see some benefit to our minds. When you stop killing and lying and doing all the various things that you're doing, I'm not assuming all of you are killing a lot, but we kill a lot of critters, right? We kill a lot of insects, a lot of little beings in this world, and don't think too much of it. So if we distance ourselves from those types of behaviors, we will see our mind getting calmer, our mind getting more compassionate, more loving, more kind, more joyous. So this is the idea behind this very first line is, please bless me to see that this greatly meaningful body with freedoms and richnesses, with all of this amazing benefit, is very difficult to find and easily perishes. It's extremely difficult to get this. Easily perishes refers to the very first teaching of the path for the lower capable being. There's 4 teachings that are in the lower scope. The very first one is teaching us about death and impermanence. Once more, we tend to take this life for granted in terms of thinking we're going to have a nice long life. And I hope all of you have a wonderful long life, with complete faculties and an ability to practice all the way till your deathbed, through your deathbed. But nonetheless, we don't know for sure that that's going to happen, right? But we assume that. We don't recognize how quickly this life can be over. Just some mishap, some accident, something goes wrong, and suddenly the life comes to an end. And we've known that for other people that are in our circle of friends, right? I'm sure all of you have someone in your circle of friends or relatives who's passed away at this point. So you know that this happens and can happen at any time. Of course, there are many more detailed teachings in the Lam Rim around maintaining that awareness on how this life is very fragile, how we need to embrace the use of this life as much as we can. I'm going to read one little verse that Rinpoche shares from his commentary on this from Milarepa. He says, by remembering impermanence and death, you become victorious over laziness. Remembering death again and again generate the realization of impermanence. Then from morning to night, whatever you do becomes Dharma. This is the import of that very first teaching of these four in the lower scope, is it gets us off our butt. It makes us, practice more because we recognize that we may not have that latter part of our life when we can maybe not be working and have the leisure to do more retreat and whatever the case might be. Hold that view that you're going to do that, but don't keep, make that an obstacle to your practice right now. It's important that we do what we can right now, because tomorrow may be the end of our life. Today may be the end of our life. We don't know for sure. So they say this is one of the most powerful meditations we can do, is our awareness of death. So particularly not just the certainty of death, but the uncertainty of the time of death, to really have that one hit home so that we then feel every day is a valuable opportunity and we don't waste it therefore. I sometimes compare it to a mundane example, like if you went off to Paris for a week, say you knew you had a week in Paris, you had your beginning time and your departure time. And instead you just decided to hang out in the hotel the whole time, right? Until the last day, and the last day you go, oh my gosh, I'm in Paris, I better go do something, And then, you have to catch your flight the next day. Well, you've wasted your trip to Paris. Well, don't waste your trip to the human realm. Don't waste this precious opportunity that you have by kind of checking out for the good portion of it and then only checking in right at the end when you go, oh my gosh, here comes death. I've got a diagnosis now, a prognosis, and I know I'm going to die. Well, now I need to practice. Well, it's a little late then. I'm not saying don't practice if that's the case, but it's a little late to have your mind all in tune with Dharma when that's what you've been doing the entire life, is just sort of checking out. So that's a very important teaching. Although it's just those two words, it easily perishes. That contains a whole wealth of meaning. And again, as I'm going through this, those of you again who weren't here for some of the previous teachings, my whole purpose is so that when you read this in the morning, you can conjure up some of that meaning to fill in this, to have that behind the scenes, so that it's not just words that you're reciting. You're actually bringing that to mind and saying, this is a very deep reflection, to say that this is difficult to find and easily perishes. And you could certainly stop at that point and do a short reflection on it if you wish, but at least have the meaning behind these words to understand that. The next line says that action and result are so profound. Well, this is referring to the law of karma. It is profound the way in which karma works. It is unfailing. There are four main principles of karma. The very first is that karma is definite or certain, meaning that the type of seed you plant, in terms of whether it's positive or negative, brings forth a fruit, a result that is in accord with that. Once more, we have that conviction in our natural world. You don't, go out there and plant tomato seeds and then get cucumbers from them. You know that it's a very different seed that you have to plant for cucumbers versus tomatoes. So you know that is the way it works in the world. You'd be shocked if you got cucumbers after you planted tomatoes. So you would also be shocked if you got suffering from a result or a cause that was virtuous. You would also be shocked if you got happiness from something that is non-virtuous. They go in the same track. Virtuous actions bring forth happy results. Non-virtuous actions bring forth suffering results. The very second of the principles of karma is that karma increases, it multiplies. And we see this in nature to some degree, right? You can take an apple seed's fairly small, right? You put it in the ground and you can get bushels and bushels of apples from it over time. And there are a lot of other factors involved, right? It's not that the apple seed itself grows into this tree and produces apples without anything else involved. So in the natural world, there need to be other factors that contribute to all of that. Karma, the actions that you create, naturally increase in your mental continuum, good or bad. If we've created positive seeds, wonderful. We can get great results from them, great happy results, wonderful results. Human existences can come from a simple act of good morality from one lifetime. That's a pretty amazing result from just one little act of being kind, generous to another person. refraining from killing that being. So this principle that karma increases, of course, where it becomes problematic is that the negative karma increases. You can produce great suffering results from even the smallest non-virtuous actions. And the third and the fourth are kind of two sides of it in terms of whether you haven't created the cause or you have created the cause. You cannot experience the result if you haven't created the cause. If you do create the cause, you will experience the result. So it's kind of these two principles by which karma abides, that you will, if you are experiencing it, you definitely created the result, because you cannot experience the result without having created the causes. Just like you cannot get that vegetable garden without having done all the causes that are about creating a wonderful vegetable garden. It's the same in our physical world. We just, again, don't have the same attention to our world of experience. The fourth one is anything that you have done then. If you planted the seed in the ground, if you kind of put all the energy into it, then it will definitely bring forth its result. Of course, we have ways of interrupting the result or interfering with the result. That's one of the blessings of the Buddha, is that the Buddha has given us a technique for purifying any of the negative karma and also being attentive to make sure we don't destroy our positive karma. I'm not going to go into all of that as part of today's teaching, but that is an important part of our daily practice, to kind of spend some time at the end of our day tidying up our mess, so that if we've done things that are non-virtuous, if we know that we've stepped in it again, at least try to pull that seed out before it takes root and becomes something that can bring forth great suffering. So this is the way that we tend to our karma and understand its profundity, is by acknowledging these four principles: that karma is certain, that karma increases, that we cannot experience the results without having created the causes, and that once the causes are established, they're not wasted. That karma done will eventually bring forth its result. So with that in mind, of course, there are many more teachings on karma. Venerable Amy was here at the end of October doing a whole weekend on karma. And hopefully some of you had the opportunity to take teachings with her. But in any of the Lam texts, and if you need any suggestions for those, just let me know after the class or during the break. But there's extensive teachings on karma and all the intricacies of karma. The Buddha gave actually a lot of teachings on karma, but as I said, it's just a structure to help us to understand how it works. We can't know it for fact. Yeah. I use a lot of my lines again and again, but this one I like. If we had the ability to know, the immediate effects of our karma, for example, if we were getting ready to step on an ant or squash a mosquito and a huge foot was coming down on us, we'd get it right away. We'd go, okay, I'll stop, But that huge foot, we don't see. That doesn't come until much later. There's a time element. Just as there's a time element with the apple seed becoming all the bushels of apples, right? There's a time element with karma as well. And there's no definiteness in terms of when it's going to ripen. When the causes and conditions are there, we meet with that particular circumstance, it can ripen into an experience, good or bad. So karma is a very, very profound topic and a difficult one. But it's really the principle by which initially in this first stage, the graduated path of the lower capable being, we're able to create the causes for a good rebirth. In the next stage, by practicing the law of karma in terms of creating the causes and conditions for our own liberation, we can achieve that result. That's the graduated path of the middle capable being. We follow the same principle of cause and effect when it comes to the great capable being. All three of the levels of the path are based on the concept of cause and effect, that things depend, to achieve certain results, it depends upon the causes for them. If you don't create the causes, you're never going to get the results. Just like if you don't plant all those vegetables in your garden and tend to them, you're never going to get the wonderful vegetables at the end of the growing season, right? So this is the import of looking at the teachings on karma. So we see in that line, action and result being so profound, the next idea, and actually when we go to those four teachings, I've kind of jumped a little bit from there. We started off with death and impermanence. Karma is actually the last one, but it's introduced here because the idea is that on the basis of cause and effect, when this life ends, you will be propelled into your next existence. And if you haven't tended to creating the causes for good rebirths, the likelihood with most of us is that we're going to end up in an unfortunate state. That's what this next line is going to, and that's the second of the main topics that are taught in the lower scope, that the sufferings of the evil gone transmigratory beings are so difficult to bear. If we end up as one of those beings, and the Buddha taught that there are three realms of existence that are these unfortunate states, we don't have direct contact with two of them. So it's kind of hard once more for us to have conviction in those because we don't have the ability to see them right before our eyes. But those are a hellish sort of existence, the naraks, the hell realms. Those are not just hot hells like they're taught in the Christian tradition, but there are cold hells. There are different other realms of great suffering. Through great affliction and great negative actions, beings can end up in such an unfortunate state, the Buddha says. Then there's the hungry ghost realm, the preta realm, where beings, through the force of their strong desirous mind, end up being thwarted in obtaining what they need to even satisfy their basic hunger and thirst. These beings are more like spirits that live in the world. And then we have the animal realm. Of course, there we have an ability to see how animals live their lives and what their lives are like. So we can gain some conviction, at least in terms of an animal existence and developing some desire to not end up in such a state. The Buddha says we've been in all three of those states countless times. And the problem is there's great suffering there, as it says. The sufferings in those realms is unbelievable. Even just having the mind of one of those beings would be unbelievable. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says that if you had the mind of an animal, even like your little pets, your dogs and cats and whatever that are well treated, if you had their mind for like 5 minutes, you would never want to be reborn as an animal. Because compared to the acuity, the sharpness that we have with our own minds, their minds don't have that. They lack that. They're constantly plagued by a lot of fear, anxiety. I mean, we don't know what our pets do when we're not home, right? Some of them sleep, obviously, but there's still, a lot of dogs are pretty neurotic when people aren't around, right? They really, where'd they go? Are they coming back? I hope they come back. I want to eat, Who knows what thoughts they have? But that's kind of what entertains the mind of an animal, is constantly wanting to be protected from danger, from fear. Most animals don't have the comforts that our pets have, right? So if we were to end up in one of those unfortunate states, it would be great suffering. Now, again, when I introduce the lower realms, which is that second topic, I think it's important that we maybe not exclusively talk about existences, whole entire places that we can be, but even the sort of hellish existences or hungry ghost-like existences that exist in the human realm, or animal-like existences that exist in the human realm. It's not, we don't have to go that far to see the suffering that can happen on the basis of karma. So we don't want to end up in an unfortunate state, end up in a part of the world where there's great strife and suffering, where we won't even have the opportunity to work with our minds because we're worried about missiles coming down from the sky and, whatever, soldiers coming to our door, whatever the case might be. So I think it's important that, when we get these teachings, not be so literal necessarily, but certainly open our minds to the idea that all of this is in your hands. Whatever type of existence you want to create for yourself, it's in your hands. So this is the second teaching of the 4 that are in the lower scope. Starts with death, and then the understanding that on the basis of karma, when this life ends, you could be propelled into an unfortunate state. On the basis of that unfortunate state, you may not be able to practice a lot of virtue. It may be a while before you exit out of the lower realms because it's very hard to create positive karma there. Eventually you will, because we've all been there before and we've come out of it. We're in a human existence now, but it's very hard once more to get back into that human existence. Then finally, that's the end of that beginning thought, because that's the first 2 of the lower scope that set up the idea of our situation. We're going to die and we may end up in an unfortunate state. Well, what's the answer to that? It says there, please bless me first to take refuge from the depths of my heart in the 3 rare sublime ones, and then to abandon negative karma and to accomplish virtue according to the Dharma. So those are the 2 other teachings that are laid out in the lower scope, the teachings on refuge and the teachings on karma. Now, refuge is a process, as I was talking about in yesterday's class when we're going through refuge as part of discovering Buddhism. It's not a moment in time, it's a continual process of finding greater and greater conviction in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, these 3 jewels. The Buddha, of course, being enlightened beings in general, but the Buddha himself who brought these teachings to this world and, gave these teachings over the 45 years of his life that we continue to follow. But then, of course, the teachings themselves are the main jewel that we have to depend upon. That's the Dharma, the teachings that the Buddha gave, as well as the realizations we can gain of those teachings. All of what we have in texts and what have you, those are symbolic of what we want to generate in our own minds. The whole purpose of it is to generate them in our continuum, to actually take the medicine of the Dharma, to transform our minds so that we can become just like the Buddha. But we need assistance. We need people to help us on that path. And that's what we call the Sangha. Sangha we use loosely, and even like in the Vipassana tradition, they often call their communities Sanghas, right? And it's okay to think of this as Sangha, but realize there are limitations, because if everyone else in the room is just practicing like we are, they might not have the greater ability and skill and knowledge that we ideally want to be guided by. So we can't always rely on everyone else in the room, but we can certainly rely on those beings who have shown, demonstrated through their learning, their knowledge, their abilities, that they do have some greater awareness of these teachings. Particularly that they've realized the wisdom of emptiness, which isn't coming up yet in this section, but it's the most profound thing that the Buddha taught. If they have that level of realization, then they become very dependable for us, very reliable. So again, we're going to explore some of those concepts in Module 7. But refuge, as I mentioned yesterday, Alex Berzin, another teacher in the Gelugpa Tibetan Buddhist tradition that we practice here, he uses the term finding safe direction. That refuge is about finding safe direction in your life, coming to understand that there is a way that I can be assured that I'm going to be protected from having to experience the lower realms, having to experience future existences, whatever the case might be. Our refuge grows and develops as we go through the stages of the path. Initially, it's like the sense that I want to have safe direction to make sure that when this life ends, I've got my future life insurance. I can make sure that when I breathe my last breath, that I'm actually going to be heading to another existence that will be as beneficial as this one, as useful as this one, as opportune as this one. So this is the idea behind refuge. But what are you primarily taking refuge in? As I just said a few minutes ago, the Dharma, but especially at this level, the teachings on karma, to develop that conviction and desire to practice according to what the Buddha taught, to avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, as it says there, to abandon negative karma, and to accomplish virtue according to Dharma, to engage in not just the refraining from those negative actions, but also to engage in actions that are beneficial, that are helpful for others, through acts of kindness, generosity, compassionate deeds, what have you. To be dedicated to the welfare of others as much as possible creates very virtuous karma, very positive karma. So I'm once more not going to go into the full list of all these things, because I think it'll take this Sunday class beyond what we want to do with it, which is mostly just to give you enough awareness to read through this and have some understanding behind it. But by all means, go to a Lama text if you need to examine some of these topics further, because there's quite a bit on karma. The 10 non-virtues are all set out. These are the ways that we engage in non-virtue physically, through things like killing and stealing, verbally, through lying, dividing others with our speech, and so on. And then mentally, through engaging in harmful thoughts towards others, covetous thoughts, those sorts of things. So again, there's a lot of teachings behind all of this that I'm just, again, feeling like it's not as important that I go to those places, because we'll probably be here, going through this text until I leave again in May when Geshe-la returns. So anyway, this is the idea behind this entire verse, then, is to say, okay, I'm in this opportune state, and this is going to come to an end. When it comes to an end, I don't think I can bear the suffering of the lower realms. I mean, look at how hard it is to bear the suffering of the human life. Look how hard it is when you've got, a really bad headache, or when you have some other physical pain, or the mental anguish that we go through in terms of loss and grief and all the various things that we have to experience. The lower realms, the suffering is magnified beyond what we can even imagine. As Rinpoche often says, even like a fire spark in the hell realms is hotter than the biggest conflagration. Is that the word? Conflagration? It's a hard word to pronounce. Of fire that we imagine, like in California, these fires that happened recently. That type of heat, a fire spark in the hell realms is hotter than that. I mean, we can't even imagine it. Again, I'm not trying to freak people out. This isn't me becoming a Baptist minister or something. But Lama Zopa does that sometimes. He taught on the hell realm really extensively a number of times, and that seemed to be his main topic when he began teaching, was just to put that kind of, and it's not, again, it's a wholesome fear. It's a wholesome sense of dread, because we have to generate some awareness of this. If the Buddha is speaking the truth, which once more is for each of us to check up, to make sure that there's something that we can find that we can rely upon in terms of the Buddha's teachings, then by extension, we can say, well, the Buddha has no reason to lie about these things. He has no reason to give us misinformation. Why? Because Buddha's solely driven by compassion for beings, doesn't want any one of us to suffer unnecessarily. Of course, we haven't talked about the way in which we're all suffering unnecessarily in the end, because it's just due to an error in our minds. If we were to understand that final, way of how things exist, we wouldn't suffer for one more second. But as long as we're in this state, it's good to follow the advice of the Buddha, to pay attention, to heed the words that the Buddha says in terms of how to avoid this. So on the basis of understanding we're going to die and potentially go to one of those realms of suffering, we need to have a refuge. We need to have something that will protect us, a safe direction in our lives. And therefore, the main teaching we rely upon at this level are the teachings on karma, because that's how you actually affect your future existence. Okay, so let me just introduce the next verse, and we'll do a little bit of a teaching on it. We'll take a break in about 5 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes. Let's go ahead and read this next verse that has to do with the graduated path of the middle capable being, the next level of practice. In dependence upon that, even if I achieve the mere higher rebirth of a deva or human, I will still have to experience suffering endlessly in samsara, because of not having abandoned and being under the control of the disturbing thought obscurations. Therefore, please bless me to reflect well upon the way of circling in samsara and to continuously follow day and night the path of the 3 types of precious trainings, the principal method for becoming free from samsara. So maybe before I start that commentary, I will read the last little bit of Rinpoche's commentary on the previous one. He says, the motivation of the lower capable being, which is unstained by the 8 worldly dharmas, meaning getting involved in all of our attachment to things, being comfortable in this life, things, having gain in this life, praise and so on, all of those sorts of attachments. And by attachment to this life, Rinpoche says, is to seek the happiness of future lives. With that motivation, everything becomes Dharma. So that harkens back to that little verse on the previous page at the bottom. Please, Gurus, bless my mind to become Dharma, is that if you practice according to the principles we just talked about, your mind becomes Dharma. You start practicing Dharma. Start practicing in reality what the Buddha taught, which begins with assuring that we have a good rebirth. In this next set of teachings, of course, I love how these verses are put together, where it says this one and the next one. It says, in dependence upon that, even if I get one of these good rebirths. And it's mentioned in there, Deva. Deva is a god realm. There's also what are called the demigods, these god type of beings that have some conflict with the gods. Nonetheless, those sorts of realms of existence, they say, are even more idyllic than the human realm. The problem is the human realm actually has the right combination of suffering and happiness. For most of us, I'm not saying, there are some people certainly who are born with pretty tragic conditions that cause chronic suffering throughout their entire life. But nonetheless, for most human beings, we have a measure of happiness, a measure of suffering, and a lot of stuff in between. And so we end up knowing that there's some contrast between those two. If you were in a really idyllic state, and maybe this even happens in the human realm to some degree, we have our sort of gods and demigods and the 1% perhaps, those people who are hanging out with without a whole lot of other concerns, right? They know that every day their meal's going to be prepared for them, a bed is going to be made for them, all these various things are going to happen and what have you. You get kind of soft in a sense, right? You don't realize that this life is suffering. Of course, there's mental suffering that goes with those states. Not to say that they don't have mental suffering, but nonetheless, in the human existence for most of us, we do have a measure of those two, that we can actually use this life with some awareness that it's not ideal, that it's not something that we want to embrace as, the be all and end all, because there are problems, there are difficulties. Even those people in the high realms, of our human existence do have to face death and illness and so on. It's not that they're free of all of that. But nonetheless, they can be blind to that reality for quite a bit of their time. The same thing happens, they say, in the Deva realm. You're born into the God realm and you have this beautiful, magnificent God body that's like, flawless, and until 7 days before you die. And then it starts to decay. And all the beautiful flowers that were adorning you and everything begin to wilt. and people stop hanging around you because you start to smell, you know. This is, they say the mental suffering in the God realm when you're going through that process of dying is unequaled in samsara, because you thought you were in some sort of idyllic place. You were convinced that this is what it was all about. And then suddenly it all starts decaying and you see that you're moving out of that into a lower existence. You kind of waste all that good karma on this idyllic existence. So even though it says that, even if I achieve this mirror higher rebirth of a deva or a human, it's not ideal to end up in a deva realm. You can have some more opportune existences within it, but generally it's not an ideal condition. But nonetheless, if you practice good karma and you end up in such a fortunate existence, as it says there, I will still have to experience suffering endlessly in samsara. Of course, endlessly is a big word, right? It's not endless in that you cannot get any end to it. It will seem endless until you create the causes for the end of it. It will continue until you have that. But you will suffer endlessly in samsara unless you do what's the next line is alluding to. If you abandon and get out of being under the control of the disturbing thought obscurations, then you will be free. But because we will be under the control of those, we will continue to go from life to life. So this is where in this initial sort of part that's the setup, this is the very first part of the middle scope teachings, or the scope for the middle capable beings, as Rinpoche talks about them. It's where we start to see the reality of what we're involved in, which is this wonderful little word called samsara. Samsara essentially means cyclic existence. It means we're going from life to life. As I mentioned, because mind is continuous, because every moment of mind arose from a previous moment of mind, there's no beginning to our existences. I know I sit with the interfaith group, and one of the priests there who I talked to, we had our little discussion. His mind, in terms of his theology and his dogma and what he practices, cannot get his head around the concept of beginningless time, because they're convinced there's a creator God who started the whole process from which all of this came. And when I try to explain it, it doesn't make any sense to him. But when he talks about what he's saying, it doesn't make any sense to me, because it makes sense in my mind that everything arises from its respective causes. Well, what's the cause of mind? It has to be another moment of mind. Mind can't come from matter. You can't come and get mind from the petals of this flower. Mind has to come from something that's the same nature as it. So this idea that we've had these lives since beginningless time means that we've been under the control of these factors, as it says there, under the control of the disturbing thought obscurations since beginningless time. Sounds like it's pretty difficult to overcome then, right? Well, it is and it isn't. Through the force of those minds, we become very habituated to that. That's why we continue to go from life to life, is that we follow those minds of attachment and anger and ignorance and so on. But with the Buddha's teachings, you can be liberated from that. You can annihilate those causes. You can be free of them once and for all. But our predicament currently is that, and that's kind of like the first two truths of the Four Noble Truths, is that we're in a state that's unsatisfactory, what we call dukkha in the Sanskrit. Dukkha essentially means more than just the gross levels of suffering. It means that we are also dealing with the dissatisfaction that we experience on the basis of even the pleasurable things in life that don't last, that don't ultimately satisfy. And that's because we're in this conditioned existence under the control of these factors. Wherever we go, because we have the delusions, we're going to be plagued by some level of dissatisfaction, suffering. That's our condition. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is that there are causes to that. The causes are our karma, which we already talked about, but our karma doesn't come from nowhere. Our karma is created on the basis of what's going on in our minds. The main cause of your suffering are your disturbing thought obscurations, the afflictions, delusions that we have in our minds. The primary one being our ignorance of the nature of reality, our ignorance of the nature of the self, the I, the person, as well as all phenomena. This is what we're going into on Wednesday night on the class on Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom, this wisdom of the middle way, trying to clearly articulate that wisdom that will help us to overcome the ignorance that's at the root of all of our suffering. So this is the idea behind the first two lines or few lines of this, is the first two truths, that on the basis of even whatever existence we end up in, we're going to experience some level of dukkha, some level of dissatisfaction. And we're going to just keep going from life to life because we're under the control of these causes, our karma, but especially the disturbing thought obscurations, the afflictions, the delusions. So maybe I'll go into this a little bit more. Let's go ahead and take our break. So Leah's question, for those who are online, has to do with animal rebirths that I was talking about earlier, and kind of the idea that they can't necessarily practice virtue, and how would they engage in something that would allow them to break out of that state. Or to, again, the idea behind karma is that we've all created so much karma since beginningless time. I mean, we've always had a wealth of karma. And what we've been going through on Wednesday night in particular is this process by which a specific karma will ripen at the end of a life and propel us into our next life. It's only one action that ripens into a particular result, such as a human rebirth or an animal rebirth. So we've created both virtuous and non-virtuous seeds, if you will, since beginningless time. They're in our mental continuum. There are a lot of other factors that help those to potentially come into play at the end of a particular life. So even if you have an animal existence where the animal is never engaging in anything that's an intentional act of virtue, I mean, some animals do, are able to rescue their kittens from a burning building or whatever the case might be, all these various things that we see. There's lots of animal acts of kindness that make their way on Facebook, I see, and it's sweet to see, when these animals do these things. But even if they don't do that, at the end of that life, maybe because of other factors coming into play, a virtuous seed could ripen into propelling them into a human existence. So there's no, again, it's not that it still means that we should try our best to avoid ending up in the lower realm, even in animal rebirth, because we have no guarantee that that's going to happen at the end of that life. We could get propelled into a deeper state of suffering. We could just continue to have more animal rebirths. You could end up being there for quite a long time before you actually resurface, in a sense, and get back to a human existence. So, I mean, certainly, if you have pets, Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche encourages us to do a lot of things for our pets, so that we plant some of these sort of seeds in their mind, some conditions that can help them to have a good rebirth in the next life. If you're leaving your dog or your cat, whatever, at home during the day, you can put on a little CD of mantras, and then the mantras will be playing all day. Put it on a loop, and then they'll be hearing mantras. Now, your cat or your dog is probably going to do what they normally do when you're gone, but at least it's a little kind of one little thing that Rinpoche says might encourage some ripening at the end of that life that could be favorable. When there's animal blessings, like we used to have the relics come through, the Buddha relics and the relic tour. It's good to have blessings from relics or from holy beings or whatever with animals. Rinpoche, when he was in Moscow, he did an animal blessing over there. It was very sweet. I saw a bit of it online. And, so any of those kinds of making connections with the Dharma, with holy beings, with holy objects, with all these things, they're useful to help bring those things to fruition. But obviously most animals don't have the kind of volition, the intention to be able to direct their minds into engaging in virtue. So Rowena, for those online, was just sharing the idea that from her observation, animals do pick up on our states of mind when we have more virtue, more compassion, doing our practice, whatever the case might be, that can be a beneficial thing for them. Yeah, we have to take that responsibility to try to create the most wholesome and good environment for the beings that we do have that control over. The beings that are at large out in the wild, we don't have much control over them at all, obviously. But so June's question is this idea of one particular action being the projecting karma, as we call it, that propels you into your next existence at the end of that. And even though you might have engaged in a lot of virtue in this life, if you happen to engage in non-virtue and die shortly after that, would that be? Well, I mean, we do say that, again, there are different factors that are involved in this, and we can't know all the intricacies of karma, but they do lay out that, I think with the order, I don't have the notes in front of me, but usually they say the one that is closest to the time of death is the one that will ripen. But then there's also the one that we're most frequent, that we've most habituated towards. So if you've done a whole lot of virtue in your life, and maybe even if you've had regret as part of that negative action that happened closer to your death, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be fully under the control of that, because if you've engaged in something else that's much stronger, that's heavier through that life, that's positive, then that could propel you. But the idea is that it's definitely a single act, because it has to be a complete act. We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday night, how the act has to bring all the way to completion on the basis of other factors involved, having a being that we identify as being, for in the example of killing, a being that we've identified as a being that we want to kill, having that motivation, wanting to kill it, doing the preparation for the actual killing, having some delusion in our mind around that, and then coming to a conclusion that the being dies and we've, succeeded in our act of killing. So once that's complete, it's planted a single seed on our mental continuum, and it started a process that can ripen into a future existence. But because we've done those many, many, many times over countless lifetimes, we have a lot of seeds that are all waiting there to ripen to take us into an unfortunate state or into a fortunate state. We don't, it can be something we do in this life. I'm not saying it won't be, but there's also the possibility of karmas from other lifetimes. For example, what we were talking about with Leah's question of the animal realm. So if you're born in an animal realm, but you have good conditions, that being around people who are practicing Dharma, having all these various things happening, and then one of the karmic seeds that you planted many lifetimes ago that was virtuous can come to the forefront and take you into your next existence. It's not the only factor, though, because obviously that's what we call projecting karma. We're going to go into this in the karma module. You have a whole bunch of other stuff that's called completing karma. This is like the basic outline of the painting. This is filling in all the details. Your whole life is determined by karma, where you're born, the environment that you're born into, your physical health. The longevity of this life is determined when you are born into this existence, in terms of that. There's a karmic propensity for how long you will live. Not that you're predetermined how long you're going to live. It's how long that life will go if there's no interruptions to that life. You could have an interruption to that life on the basis of an accident or illness or whatever the case might be. But all of that stuff fills out the picture. So you have a whole lot of other karma. But then your main existence, the main thing that you're talking about, whether it be a human, an animal, whatever, that's determined by a single karma, a single action that we've engaged in. And again, there are different, we'll go into this on this coming Wednesday night in terms of the factors that dictate which of those karmas come to the forefront. I like to use the example of airplanes in a hangar. They're all ready to go out, but which one comes to the front and gets to the front of the line and goes out in front of everyone else, taking us to our next life? Well, we've got tons of airplanes in the hangar, all these like waiting to take us to another existence. And only one comes out at the end of every life in terms of that particular karma with that particular result, what we call a fruitional result from a projecting karma, meaning it's going to take us into that next existence. Now you can, again, purify some of those. We talked about that earlier, just a process of purification. And you can also destroy some of the good ones if you have a really angry mind or something like that, so these really destructive states of mind. But it's all, I mean, and I'm just talking in general terms, all of it in terms of how the specific working would be in any particular lifetime would be beyond the knowledge of an ordinary being. So Don's question is, if you have a act of killing where it's involved in saving the lives of others, by taking one person's life, you're saving the lives of others, or whatever, these sorts of scenarios where we might call them justifiable killings or self-defense killings potentially even. But I mean, yours is more the idea that other people are going to be benefited by your taking the life of that other being. And these get to be really tricky because, everything comes down to our motivation. Now, the problem is when we say, well, I'm protecting this whole group of people by taking the life of this person, we're not looking at everyone. The ideal scenario is to have compassion for everyone. If we have compassion for this group and we take the lives of these people because we don't have compassion for them, again, as much as possible, this is why His Holiness is always emphasizing, that nonviolence, that we should engage in whatever acts we can do to protect, to save others, to do what's necessary, but not take the lives of others, not engage in violent behavior on the basis of a compassionate motivation. Nonetheless, there's a very rare example from the life of previous lifetimes of the Buddhas where he did engage in a violent act of taking the life of another being. But it was because he did have compassion, they say, for everyone involved. I think it can be hard for us in our state to have compassion to that degree because we tend to be somewhat biased. We tend to think that there's a victim and there's a perpetrator, and the perpetrator's wrong, and we need to do everything we can to get them out of our existence. And the poor victim, we have a lot of compassion for them. So I don't know. I mean, these get to be indeterminate karmas in terms of when you do have some level of a compassionate motivation. I don't think it's complete enough for it to be a virtuous action by any means. You know, you're still going to have the act of killing because you have taken the life of a being that you intended to take. You know, but the motivation was, again, moving in the right direction, but not. This doesn't. We shouldn't be going any acts of killing on the basis of simply observing the people who might be harmed by that being. You know, I don't know. These are tricky ones. There's never really sort of a solid answer for them because it depends upon so many of the circumstances at the time. But if you have that pure compassionate mind, as the Buddha did in this prior lifetime, and was able to know that if he took the life of this person, many other people would be saved, but he also was trying to keep that person from engaging in that negative karma. Because if you kill other beings, then you're going to have negative consequences of that. But if you take on that karma to keep that person from killing other beings, then they won't engage in that act. Other people won't be harmed by their killing, and so on. So there's many different angles to look at it, but you have to be pretty strong in your compassion for everyone involved to engage in that type of action. So Don's question is, you know, if you have a act of killing where it's involved in saving the lives of others, by taking one person's life, you're saving the lives of others, or whatever, these sorts of scenarios where we might call them justifiable killings or self-defense killings potentially even. But I mean, yours is more the idea that other people are going to be benefited by your taking the life of that other being. And these get to be really tricky because, you know, everything comes down to our motivation. Now, the problem is when we say, well, I'm protecting this whole group of people by taking the life of this person, we're not looking at everyone. You know, the ideal scenario is to have compassion for everyone. If we have compassion for this group and we take the lives of these people because we don't have compassion for them, again, as much as possible, this is why His Holiness is always emphasizing, you know, that nonviolence, that we should engage in whatever acts we can do to protect, to save others, to do what's necessary, but not take the lives of others, not engage in violent behavior on the basis of a compassionate motivation. Nonetheless, there's a very rare example from the life of previous lifetimes of the Buddhas where he did engage in a violent act of taking the life of another being. But it was because he did have compassion, they say, for everyone involved. I think it can be hard for us in our state to have compassion to that degree because we tend to be somewhat biased. You know, we tend to think that there's a victim and there's a perpetrator, and the perpetrator's wrong, and we need to do everything we can to get them out of our existence. And the poor victim, we have a lot of compassion for them. So I don't know. I mean, these get to be indeterminate karmas in terms of when you do have some level of a compassionate motivation. I don't think it's complete enough for it to be a virtuous action by any means. You know, you're still going to have the act of killing because you have taken the life of a being that you intended to take. You know, but the motivation was, again, moving in the right direction, but not. This doesn't. We shouldn't be going any acts of killing on the basis of simply observing the people who might be harmed by that being. You know, I don't know. These are tricky ones. There's never really sort of a solid answer for them because it depends upon so many of the circumstances at the time. But if you have that pure compassionate mind, as the Buddha did in this prior lifetime, and was able to know that if he took the life of this person, many other people would be saved, but he also was trying to keep that person from engaging in that negative karma. Because if you kill other beings, then you're going to have negative consequences of that. But if you take on that karma to keep that person from killing other beings, then they won't engage in that act. Other people won't be harmed by their killing, and so on. So there's many different angles to look at it, but you have to be pretty strong in your compassion for everyone involved to engage in that type of action. I was bringing up when there's not an intentional act of killing, as we would call it, like when you kill by accident. You know,
kill because you're in a group. You may yourself not really want to kill, but you're going to have to protect somebody next to you. That's where the military gets very tied in. And true, you shouldn't join the military. You don't have to draft anymore, but I'm sorry, anymore.
Well, war becomes a whole nother thing too when we start talking about that, because that still is much more intentional killing generally, even with, the idea of protecting one's platoon members or whatever the case might be. I think so again, we're going to really diverge into a discussion of karma. It inevitably happens when I open that can of worms, because everyone has that burning question. I always say this is my karma, because I used to challenge Father Mogilnicki, who was the pastor in our Catholic church. He would come in like the first Friday of every month, and I would be like, what happens if you steal a candy bar, but then you he'd be like, shut up. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you to shut up, but it's my karma, so I accept it. But these are hard things, because with killing, I mean, the one thing that they say definitely is that you have to have that one mental factor to make it complete. You have to have the intention to kill, the motivation to kill. So if you accidentally kill or kill through other actions, then you definitely haven't. But I would say that the people who are on the front line of a military, exercise in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever the case might be, they have if somebody comes charging at them wearing a suicide vest or something, they have the intention to kill that person, even though they want to save the lives of the people who are their cohorts that would be killed by this man coming forward or person coming forward. They still have that intention to kill. Now, again, there was some mediation through it being about not wanting the harm to happen to those beings. But are they concerned about that person creating the causes for their own suffering by charging into a crowd with a suicide vest? I don't think so. Rarely. So these things, again, I don't want to go to these extremes, though. I think the most important thing is that we look at our own daily lives, and what we're talking about for most of us aren't killing human beings. I don't think, that's not part of our daily life. Maybe we're
supporting organizations that do.
Well, but yeah, but that becomes even much more distant. But I'm not saying, again, because I think these get to be once more pretty deep issues to go into. If you are the person who is engaging in the act, that's a definite. If you are the one killing the mosquito or doing whatever the case might be, if you are mentally together with other people who are engaging in the act, if I'm like sitting down and rejoicing that orangutans are being killed by virtue of the palm oil business and whatever, I mean, then that's a different mindset. If you happen to be buying products that have palm oil in them, well, you're complicit to some degree, but you are not the person. Venerable Rubina, when she talks about eating meat, makes it very clear in her thinking that it's not the same act as killing. I'm not saying that you should eat meat freely and don't think about the beings whose meat you're eating, but nonetheless, it's a very different act, because you're not intending to kill when you're sitting down eating a steak or a burger or whatever the case might be. You don't have that motivation to kill. When we talk about karma, the most important factor is mental, in terms of what you're doing with your mind. If you don't have the intention to kill, you can't be engaging in the act of killing, or something that is in that same vein of like rejoicing in the killing of others. If you were somebody who's a stalwart patriot and really behind the troops being there in various countries, and you really relish hearing about the number of Taliban that were killed or ISIS members that were killed, and you rejoice in that, well, then it's the same as if you're on the front line, they say. But if you're somebody who's doing the opposite, while your country is involved in that, and we're all benefiting from being in the United States of America, because the roads that are built, everything else, the infrastructure, all of this we're benefiting from. Whether or not we benefit from other aspects of government is hard to say, but nonetheless, we are benefiting by being here. Well, we are sort of complicit at that level. But if you are mentally distancing yourself from that and saying, I want nothing to do with this, this is not something I agree with, concur with, and I oppose it, and even being vocal about your opposition to that, then you're not creating that karma, even though your country might be doing that, or the military from your country. So karma gets really kind of complex, but it boils down essentially to what's going on in your mind. That's whether you're creating the karma or not. So if you're walking through a field and there are insects underfoot and you're killing them, but you'd have no intention to kill them. I mean, sure, if you can find a safe way to walk around, fields and places where there are lots of insects that could be harmed, that's great. But if you're killing accidentally, you're not creating the karma of killing, at least at this level that we talk about complete karma. that would be one of these propelling karmas that takes you into an unfortunate state.